Welcome to History 2020. I'm Dr. Sawyer. I'll be your professor for today and hopefully for the rest of the semester. Guys, the end is nigh. The end is nigh. We've only got what? Two more lectures after this. One more full week, and then we make it to the end. Come to my review sessions. I got my projector set up last night. It's a pretty good projector, I think. So I loved it. Today we're going to talk about the rise of the new right. And essentially the foundation, I think, probably of modern political parties in the United States. Certainly our last big realignment, although we may be in the middle of another one we just can't see yet. Something's certainly changing. But anyway, that's what we'll talk about today. Anybody have any questions? Dara Patel asks, do I have to use a Dropbox link or can I just upload it? Well, I think the problem, Dara, is that D2L was created in the 1980s. And even though, Dara, now you're like, in the 80s, could they upload stuff? Well, I guess so, because you used to be able to upload files directly. But guess what? Somehow D2L was like, nah, I think they're getting too comfortable. So it took away that option to upload audio files. And that's the problem. So I know, and let me just say this. I know that some students have figured out there's some format or something you can do to upload it, but I will tell you the vast majority have not. So that's the reason I'm asking for a link in that comments box. Now you can, I hate to tell you this, but D2L you can actually use, they have a voice recorder on there where you can record through D2L. I would hate to lead you that way. I would hate to be like, hey, you know what you need in your life? More D2L. But yeah, you could do that. You could also upload it, like you could record it on YouTube and just like black out the screen, whatever you want to do. Anyway, but the link is the best option because of D2L's how should we say, limitations? Yeah, that's the word. Does that make sense? But no, it doesn't have to be specifically Dropbox, right? It just has to be a cloud link like that to work. Ben Sawyer asks, is it time for the lecture? It is time for the lecture. Let's go on. Today's lecture called The New Right. Let's talk about it. In the last lecture, we talked about the 1970s, Watergate, and the crisis of confidence. How, as a matter of fact, finding out your government lied to you about starting a war, then lied to you about winning that war, then eventually got out of that war pretty later on. And in the meantime, your boy Nixon was up to some no good, but also we were using the CIA to overthrow other governments in places. It gets so bad that Gerald Ford, you guys remember him? Gerald Ford, the only guy not to be elected to the executive to serve as president. Gerald Ford issues an executive order that says, don't kill leaders of other governments. How bad is it? All right, there are things that I have to tell Solomon he can't do. I've never once had to be like, just to be clear, no assassinating foreign leaders, because hopefully he just knows we don't do that. But who knows, right? We had an energy crisis in the early 70s. The average American, this is the thing to remember, the average American ends the decade worse off than they started it. That is heavy. There's massive inflation, as we'll talk about. And you begin to see the rise of modern conservatism. I talked about that a bit last lecture. I'm going to dig into it a little bit more now, and we are going to see your boy Ronald Reagan show up. One of the problems we have with understanding the twists and turns in the United States from a modern perspective, particularly when we're looking at this era, is that we overwhelmingly want to see things in political terms. We want to see things in partisan terms. Right? We think Republicans and Democrats. And that type of a mindset really, really prevents us from being able to see the actual dominant twists and turns. And a big change in modern history in terms of politics comes in the 1970s. I think I mentioned in the last lecture that some people consider Richard Nixon to be the last truly liberal president the United States ever had. And some people laugh at that. But the problem is that a lot of people think of liberal, and again, they associate it with a party. The issue here is when you say liberal in this sense, Nixon's the last president, even though he's a Republican, to embrace the general principle that government has a big role to play in improving people's lives. And you see Nixon being the president who oversees the birth of the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. oversees the creation of OSHA, all types of federal programs. My point being here that Nixon believes that people's lives can get better through government programs. Now he's followed by Jimmy Carter. And the thing to know here, and the thing not to lose track of, is that Democrats control Congress in these years. So it's never just the president, right? So Democrats control Congress. But Carter comes in. And for a lot of people, Carter, he's this outsider. And the thing about Carter being on the outside is that he brings in what people hope is going to be like a breath of fresh air. But he doesn't in a lot of ways, because he's skeptical of government himself, far more than Nixon was. And you see, even throughout Carter's administration, you see that he casts doubt on the federal government's power to do things. He even says this explicitly a couple of times. That transition, though, again, explained by Watergate, Vietnam, then the Church Commission report. But there are a lot of other things that converge in these years to bring about a complete reformation of the Republican Party. Now, not everyone in the party establishment goes along with this at first, but it eventually becomes essentially the foundation of the modern Republican Party. And it is a bizarre coalition of people that, from almost any perspective, if you were looking at these groups and you didn't understand the context of the 1970s, you would say, how are they going to get along? What do these folks have in common? It's hard to explain because it's not just evangelical Christians. You also have activism from other groups, the Catholics in particular. Catholics become very activist in these years. And these groups, they ally themselves, these religious groups, they ally themselves with neoconservatives who are primarily concerned with economics, primarily concerned with small government, right? They want to see an end to regulation. And then another group, which are what we call the Cold War hawks, right? When you talk about foreign policy, there's hawks and doves, right? Hawks are the ones who want to use who want to go after folks, more willing to use the military. Doves are the ones who seek diplomatic, willing to work things out and negotiate things. But the Cold War hawks begin to see Carter, and in fact Nixon to a large degree, as completely blowing the Cold War by going through this policy of detente, in which the United States and the Soviet Union works out treaties and agrees to coexist. So these folks have a lot of differences, but they find something new in this party that's going to be completely remade by Ronald Reagan and those around him. Now, to understand why Christian groups become so incredibly activist in these years, you have to get a couple of big things. And here's the problem, you can't take this outside of the context of the civil rights movement and of segregation. Let me tell you, it does not mean that the people who are pushing for one thing because of their faith mean that they are ardently segregationists. But you can't separate a lot of this. So a big motivator here, especially if you listen to a lot of modern Republicans, a big concern is the Supreme Court, right? And Democrats as well. But the Supreme Court becomes a focus of conservative politics because a couple of key decisions that happen in the 1970s. The first one, and not just the first one, there are earlier ones too, but these are the ones that sparked the new right. The first one is called Coit versus Green. This ruling was a response to the way that a lot of areas had dealt with Brown versus the board. So Brown versus the board specifically says that you cannot have segregation in public schools. So in a lot of communities, what wealthier white residents did was they created private schools. And they segregated the private schools. And they said, this is private, so you can't mess with us. Well, within those folks, a lot of them claim to be charitable organizations. And this covers pretty much all of the religious schools, the Christian schools that are set up. Now, not all of the Christian schools by any means are enforcing segregation, but plenty of them are. So what happens in 1971 is that the Supreme Court says, if you are a segregated private school, you're not a charitable organization, and you do not get tax exempt status. You have to pay taxes. And this fires up a lot of folks who have been, seen private schools as a way to escape integration. And you can imagine, because let's just put it in this context. I want you to understand how this works. It's like there are the people that want to maintain segregation, right? Don't get me wrong. There are. It's clear. Lots of documents from them. But then there are the other folks who don't. They might not be compelled by someone saying, hey, we want to segregate our school. But they might be compelled by someone saying, the federal government is going to say what you can and can't do in your own school. And if you don't do what the government says, then they'll take away your tax exempt status. That is a big, that right there is what gets a lot of people fearful of this, because it's spun by a lot of people who want to see this overturned. So you've got that. And then in 1973, a Supreme Court case that most of you are familiar with, Roe versus Wade, which upholds that women have a constitutional right to an abortion. And this kicks it in. Now, a lot of the narrative, it's interesting because a lot of the historical narrative has always centered around the idea that Roe versus Wade is really responsible for the rise in evangelical and Catholic organization and the new right. It is. It certainly matters. But now historians are tracing it back and saying, actually, a lot of the organizations that grew after Roe versus Wade, they were in the works as a response to these, to Coit versus Green and earlier lower court rulings. So that's a pretty fascinating story. It's actually linked to a recent article in the comments on this slide. Now, in 1979, all these folks come together in the evangelical movement. A lot of different forces come together into the moral majority, which is established by Jerry Falwell. And this becomes an explicitly political force, right? It's not that it's not Christian. It's just that its aim is to influence politics. And a lot of this is grassroots too. A lot of this rises up. Now, all of this is in the context of a sense that some Americans have that the rights revolution, and this is what's referred to kind of dismissively in the 60s and 70s, these series of movements to protect black rights, in this, in one hand, but that also extends to women's rights. There's a women's rights movement which pushes forward with is able to accomplish an amendment to the Constitution called the Equal Rights Amendment, which eventually does not happen. You have the gay rights movement, which a lot of Americans are terrified of this. They don't understand it, and they believe there's old thread. You associate someone who is in a different group with something really bad. So like with black folks, like the narrative is that that black men are going to rape your women. Right? So you're like, well, they're going to do that. That's a key to ethnic conflict. Right? But historically, gay people have faced the persecution that somehow because you're gay, you're a child molester. And so this is all wrapped up in it. And again, these are insane things that people associate. But there's this fear. And this all bleeds into this. People are looking for something that's simple, right? They're looking for a right and a wrong. It used to seem simple to them in their minds. And all of this builds together to motivate the social movement. And their guy turns out to be a guy named Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan is a fascinating character. Fascinating. Ronald Reagan grew up, he's the son of a guy up in a shoe store. His father had moved them around all over the place in his early life. And Reagan's father was an alcoholic. Reagan was so amazing at making stories about himself. Like Reagan played on his college football team, but he wasn't very good. But if you asked him, he'd tell you dramatic stories about it. Reagan got a job as a commentator, like a radio commentator. He went out to California and got jobs acting. He never had really big roles. People say now B movies, right? They say B movies, and they say it's not as good of a movie. But a B movie was actually a separate movie. You go see if you went to the movie theater, you'd see like the A movie, which was the one you came to see, and then there'd be a B movie. It wasn't that it wasn't a real film. It was just that it wasn't considered the one that would bring people in. And Ronald Reagan had been this actor. He had some limited success. People kind of knew who he was because he had these promotional jobs. But there's a big moment for Reagan. You guys recall, I told you in 1964, a guy named Barry Goldwater runs for president for the Republicans. And Goldwater gets destroyed. Remember, he only wins the Deep South and Arizona. That's it. Although it's remarkably won the Deep South. Goldwater's message was small government, small government, small government. The government's gotten too big. We need smaller government. And he was very hawkish in terms of the Soviet Union. He wants the hardcore confrontation with them. Goldwater lost terribly. But at the end of it, when the campaign was over, kind of the concluding remarks from this campaign came from Ronald Reagan. And he gave a speech that resonated with a lot of people. And it established him, in many ways, as the torchbearer of Goldwater's view of the world. It's fascinating because people think after 64, they're like, well, that strand of the Republican Party is dead and gone. Dead and gone. I actually was talking to a girl I know who's doing her PhD at Vanderbilt the other day. And she's working on the rise of the conservative movement in the West. And she says she actually keeps a file of every time the New York Times has proclaimed the Republican Party to be dead. Apparently they do that every couple of years. They're like, well, this is it for the Republican Party. And she's like, every time I see that, I clip it and put it into a file so I can pull them all out at the same time at one point. It's kind of funny. 1855, it's still going. 1850 still now. Anyway, now Reagan is associated with that view of the Republican Party, but a lot of people think it's dead, which is why Nixon steps back up in 68. And he brings kind of an Eisenhower view of the world. So when things fall apart with Nixon, when the American people begin looking at this crisis of the 70s, Ronald Reagan's a guy who was associated with this movement. He's a great speaker. He's a great speaker. Just go watch Ronald Reagan speak. I sat down and watched a 25-minute 1975 interview. Johnny Carson interviewed Ronald Reagan. That's what I did last night. I just sat down and watched. This is what a nerd I am. I was interested because this is like after he leaves office as the governor of California and before he announces he's running for the primary in 76. Reagan's a great speaker. And people like him. He tells very simple stories. Now, the key to Reagan's ideas, and one of the reasons why he gets so much support from these groups, is one, he wants less government regulation. He believes government regulation is standing in people's way. Two, he wants lower taxation rates. He wants the taxes lowered. And kind of central to this is the idea that if you lower taxes, then there will be more economic activity, and you might actually be able to bring in more tax revenue because there'll be more economic activity. I'll give him credit for pitching that in the 70s and early 80s. I don't know. We've run that experiment a couple times now, and I don't know that it's really held up, but, somebody will get mad at me for saying that. A lot of true believers out there. He wants to balance the budget, and this is a central thing. We've got to balance this budget. Government bloat is getting out of control. We are running ourselves into debt, and we have to balance the budget. And the last thing is a much more aggressive stance towards the Soviet Union and communism in general. He says, we've been kicked around, we've tried to work out deals with them, and these guys are awful. We've got to stand up to them. And as you can see here, between evoking a really simpler time in American history, kind of this narrative a lot of people still believe, the 1950s, when things were just perfectly great and everybody got along. He comes to America, the American people, with a very simple idea. In fact, in his inauguration speech, he talks about the city on a hill, shining city on a hill is what he calls it. He wants America to be this thing. And he evokes the Puritans who said that their colony would be a city on a hill, something for everyone to look at and model themselves on. And Reagan brings back this promise of American exceptionalism. Simpler times. You can see why his message appeals to that large group of people and very diverse group of people in the new right. And dang, did I mention he's a great speaker? Man, I could listen to this guy talk all day. I don't know what's going on. And some people are like, I knew that he was a conservative guy who loved Ronald Reagan. I didn't say that. Look, you guys got to quit trying to peg me on those things. I said he's a great speaker. Objectively, I think he's a great, well, I can't say subjectively, I think he's a great speaker. So do a lot of people. Anyway, go watch him speak. I've always said if Ronald Reagan got on TV and said, the only way this country can be saved is if Ben Sawyer runs as fast as he can in front of a car. Boy, I'd be out there running before I realized what happened. Good speaker. Anyway. So that's your boy Reagan. He comes into office. Interesting story about Reagan. Well, I don't want to get there yet because we're not to the 1980 election. Now, I mentioned before that Carter comes in and he's really an outsider. I'm actually going to skip this out. And boy, a lot of people are excited about him. Interestingly enough, at the same time that you have the formation of evangelical Christianity as an activist group, you have a president, the first president in American history, Jimmy Carter, who himself is an evangelical Christian. So you might think, wow, this is perfect for evangelicals. They've got their guy in office without even really needing to reach the peak of their power. But in one of the most interesting moves in history, evangelicals do not back Jimmy Carter. They go with Ronald Reagan. They go with the actor. They go with the guy who'd been divorced. To be fair, it wasn't Reagan's choice to be divorced, but it's a very interesting term. However, Carter came in and a lot of people were excited about him. But boy, the end of the 70s are a hard time. Just ask me. I know. I was born then. At home, it's not safe. Okay, never mind. Sorry. In the international scene, there are a lot of problems that are going to hit Carter at the end of his administration. All right, so you guys, if you look at the picture on the slide here, you may notice that here you have Jimmy Carter with the Shah of Iran. Shah's a birthday party. Jimmy Carter goes and visits. He's in Iran. You may know the Shah of Iran as the guy that we helped install with the CIA in the 1950s when we deposed the democratically elected government of Iran. Remember that? Okay, so here's Carter hanging out with the guy. The guy's a tyrant, though. And what ends up happening is that in July of 1979, there is a revolution in Iran. They rise up and they overthrow this guy, the Shah. The Shah has health issues. And he begs other countries, please take me in. Please take me in. Now, this guy is a villain in this revolution in Iran. And when he puts out a call and says, who will take me in? Carter says, come on here. Now, whether or not that was a sweet thing to do seems to have kind of been a bad idea, because after this, in November of that year, there's another surge upon the U.S. Embassy in which Iranian revolutionaries, they take about 50 hostages of our people from our State Department. If you guys seen the movie Argo, that's what this is about. Carter cannot figure out how to end this. He's trying to negotiate to get these folks back, but needless to say, he is not in the good graces of the new leadership in Iran. So, it's making him look weak. The same year, later on, good gracious, about a month and a half later, the Soviet Union rolls into Afghanistan, where there had been the ruling government in Afghanistan they had been in alliance with the Soviet Union. There's a shakeup, and there's some question that they're going to pull away, and the Soviets send their troops right in. Now you have an emboldened Soviet Union. But to conservatives, the Hawks side of things, they're like, well, yeah, of course the Soviet Union is going to roll in. You can't even deal with Iran, and we ran like hell in Vietnam. So what do you expect? The Soviet Union does this like a month after you couldn't handle the Iranians? Now, to be fair, at this point, Carter does change a lot of his policy. He does. He becomes more hawkish. He breaks from that détente policy, and he speaks, more directly and forcefully with the Soviets. But he's still unable to deal with the Iranians, and he's unable to deal with what's happening in Afghanistan. He does, however, in 1980, announce that the United States will be boycotting the 1980 Olympic Games in Moscow, the Soviet Union, the capital. So that really showed him They were like, oh my God, the Americans aren't coming. I guess we'll have to win more medals. I don't know why that was a good response, but that's what Carter does. He announces they were boycotting it. Interesting side note: a couple years ago, his his national security advisor, Zygmunt, I always say his name wrong. Brzezinski is his last name. Brzezinski. Brzezinski admitted that that his people had laid a trap to try to lure the Soviet Union into Afghanistan. So that's pretty interesting that essentially our intelligence services were trying to encourage the Soviets to invade while at the same time chastising them in public. Wow. That's fascinating. Don't worry. It'll all end well because it's Afghanistan. And if there's one thing we know, people always come back from there all right. Anyway, by the way, why did Brzezinski want to lure the Soviets into Afghanistan? Well, this is going to blow your minds. As it turns out, historically, Afghanistan had been a nightmare for every foreign country that tried to occupy it. You can go back to the British. The British tried to occupy it, 100 years before this. Couldn't really hold it down. In fact, Rudyard Kipling, if you ever heard of him, the poet, he had a poem called The Young British Soldier, and there's a line in it that says, I believe it concludes, and when you're wounded and dying on Afghanistan's plain and the women from the town come to pluck at your remains, just roll on your rifle and blow out your brains and go to your God like a soldier. Historically, not a very easy place to hold down is what I'm saying. So Brzezinski was like, man, if anyone's crazy enough to invade Afghanistan, they're going to get locked into, what turns out to probably be the closest thing the Soviets had to their Vietnam. It was brutal. Good thing we learned from history. Anyway, you've got all this happening, and you're seeing what's an interesting note is that in the Middle East, with what's happening in Iran, where you have the establishment of the Islamic Republic of Iran under the Ayatollah, a religious leader, the creation of a theocracy, and you're seeing essentially the Taliban, the Mujahideen is who they're fighting there. The Soviets are fighting. The Mujahideen, they have a faith-based view based in Islam. What you're starting to see is like, whereas before this, in a lot of the world, the resistance to the United States, a lot of it had come in the Middle East and Central Asia through communism. You're starting to see the emergence of revolutionary movements based on Islam, which I don't know if you guys know. It's going to stick around. So Carter is dealing with all this on the international level. Now you're like, but surely things are better back home, where you just told me in the country where you just told me that the decade was going to end worse off than it began. Oh, bad news, guys. Let's just break this down for you. First of all, the United States gets caught in this problem called stagflation. You guys ever heard of stagflation? Sounds like a bar. Come on down to stagflations. We got boots you can drink out of. Now, don't go to that bar, let me tell you, because you'll go in and your money will get worth less, but the beers will just don't go there. Carter in the 19th, and this has already begun, but Carter inherits this, right? And we all want presidents to solve our problems first, right? He said he's going to solve it. Stagflation is a phenomenon where inflation goes up, but the economy is stagnant. So what happens is the average cost of your daily goods, the things that you need, the consumer price index, right? Those things increase. And the economic growth and the pay that workers receive does not keep up with that. So you might even, if you're looking at 5% inflation, you might get a 3% raise. And that's cool, right? But you're still making less in terms of what you can buy. Look at these numbers, friends. Look at the numbers of inflation here. If you look at this, right, so it's like pretty low over here. Look, you get to 70, right? And remember, the dollar was, did I even talk about this? I don't think I talked about this. But the dollar was allowed to float. It was unpegged from gold under Nixon. And look at what happens. It shoots up, right? And you get right here and you get into this recession. All right. Now Carter comes in office in 70. He's elected in 76, coming in 77. He's like, hey, we're going to solve this problem. Does he solve it? Look at 1980. 1980, you're looking at about 14% inflation that year. To put this in context, as I'll show you later, if you want a home loan from somebody lending you money for 30 years, when the inflation rate is 14%, be prepared to pay like 18 to 20% interest on your home mortgages. Yup. So this is bad. You got gas crisis that had happened before. It's going to come back. So you're like, well, what are our major sources of energy? Okay, gasoline, you got that, or now you might not have that. So surely you can feel good about nuclear power though, right? Oh, bad news. March 28th, 1979, there's a mechanical failure at the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant. You have the first phases of a nuclear meltdown. Carter goes in to deal with this, and this is, God bless him. Carter had been a nuke. He had been an officer in the Navy who understood nuclear technology. He goes in to see it. Now, here's a big problem. Let me tell you when life imitates art and vice versa. About the same time, a movie had come out called The China Syndrome. And in the movie, there's a nuclear meltdown, and the government covers it up, and they say, no, there was no error there. Well, guess what? When there's this mistake, or when there's this almost meltdown at the 3 Mile Island plant, without meaning to, the people who run the factory come out and tell everybody almost the exact same thing the guy in the movie said. And people are like, the movie's happening. Carter goes in and he's like, I'll check this out. I know how nuclear technology works. He goes in, he looks at it, and he's like, everything's fine. And everyone's like, it was almost a meltdown, man. Makes Carter look like he doesn't know what he's doing. There's actually a great SNL sketch making fun of that too. Earlier than this, you already had this neighborhood called Love Canal. Remember we talked last time about the cities, right? We talked about the environmental catastrophe, right? The Cuyahoga River catching on fire. Now here's the thing about these events I'm talking about here. These aren't in the downtowns. These are happening outside of the city, in the world of the suburbs. Remember that safe place where everyone moved after World War II to get away from all the troubles of American life downtown, where they could be safe and away from poverty and all the... Okay. So nuclear power plants are not in downtown cities. They're on the outskirts. In Love Canal, this is a neighborhood. Love Canal is the funniest name ever. This was a neighborhood, though. And here's what went down. A chemical corporation had purchased land outside of Buffalo in the mid to the 1940s and dumped like 21,000 tons of toxic material into this, into a landfill, right? And then they were going to get in huge trouble for it. So they covered it up with like clay and a couple layers of things. And they sold it to the school board of the town with a clause in there being like, hey, you guys, buy it like you got it. If anything's wrong, you guys have to deal with it. The school board didn't use it, so then a developer purchased it and built about 100 homes, built a nice suburb. And they named it Love Canal because it's right by the Love Canal. And about 100 families, there's total about 700 or 800 people lived in this neighborhood. And the problem was that the groundwater is like right near where this stuff has all this sludge is. And when it rains, for example, kids, there's stories where kids could light the water coming out of the ground on fire. There was a huge rain in Love Canal. Huge. It was a snowstorm. It melted. It went into the groundwater. It pushed this sludge up through. It was in the basements of the houses. Carter orders an evacuation of about 100 of the people there. And later on, has to order a complete evacuation of the area. It's like the first Superfund site, if you guys know what this is. Like massive environmental contamination site. It's like the first Superfund site in American history. This was a suburban neighborhood. Nobody's safe. It's all of this at the same time. And Carter, again, that people perceive that he's not dealing with that right. So, on top of this, let me add to this as well. In 1979, there's another gas crisis. Now, this first gas crisis had been caused by a war in the Middle East, right? The U.S. backing Egypt. It's a long story, but there had been, a breakdown in our foreign relations over the Sinai Peninsula, a war between Israel and Egypt. In 79, it looks like there's going to be an oil shortage again. But it starts in California. See, what happens is this is the problem with a crisis and a run, right? We talked about this on banks, but on other things, you can have a self-fulfilling prophecy where you say there's going to be a shortage. You guys remember toilet paper? Do you guys remember toilet paper a year ago? Do you guys remember that? Everybody was like, there's not going to be enough toilet paper. And you saw people coming out like they were going to war, like with just crates of toilet paper. And they were like, I'm never going to be without it. Now, let me ask you, dear listener, did you run out of toilet paper? You probably didn't. But you couldn't find any in the stores either, could you? You want to know why? Because somebody was like, this toilet paper is like white gold. And they ran on it. And that created a problem. This happens in California. There's signs of a gas crisis. So people start under the fear that they're going to run out of gas. Instead of going in gas every time they actually need it, people start stopping at the pump like every day. Topping off. They call it topping off. The average fill up, before this, I think it was like 8 gallons. Your average car would stop and get 8 gallons. Suddenly, that number drops to 3 gallons per stop. And then during like heavy traffic hours, a lot of people will stop. A couple of people will have to line up at the pump. Then other people will see them lining up at the pump and go, oh no, there's a run. And they'll pull in there and try to get gas. Carter is the president. Carter goes on TV and he more or less says, I told you this was going to happen. He had been pushing for a shift in energy policy. But instead of going on there and being like, guys, actually this guy, Rick Perlstein, puts it really well in the book Reaganland, where he's like, if you look at FDR, he takes over in the middle of the Great Depression. FDR says, we have nothing to fear but fear itself. We can get through this. He's like, contrast that with Jimmy Carter's statement, where Jimmy Carter goes, look what you guys did. I told you guys this was going to happen. And I told you so. The problem is he's kind of right. But anyway, he's like, I told you so. And he says, and people are going to keep acting like this. And this gas shortage is going to go sweep across the whole country. And instead of people hearing, oh man, we better chill out, or this is going to be a nationwide thing, what a lot of people heard was, oh my God, this is going to sweep across the country. And so other people in other places began filling up their gas tanks too. And there really was an oil shortage. People could only get gasoline based on the last digit on your last number on your license plate. So odd one day, even another day. Oh, Carter is lecturing to people. He's telling people, look, we can't have things forever. At some point, it can't go on forever. He goes on TV and tells people to wear sweaters instead of turning up their heat. He tells Americans to conserve resources. He tells Americans that everything isn't forever and infinite. Americans listening right now, how does it make you feel when someone tells you you can't possibly have everything one day? As a culture, we do not like that. And that's why in the election of 1980, Carter gets crucified. Reagan has built this support base. Reagan is a guy who is confident when he speaks. He's a guy who can make a joke. He's an actor, right? But he's also got experience. This is one of the things that irritates me about Reagan. People will be like, well, he was an actor. He was governor of of California for like 8 years. California's got like a larger economy itself than most countries in the world. Like, it's not like he wasn't experienced. But he shows up and he knows how to debate. And Carter is really mired down in these things. His own party sees him as an outsider. He's fighting people inside of his administration. And Ronald Reagan shows up and says, hey guys, look, you could listen to this dude over here, nerd, who's a real downer. Or how about this? We could go out. I got a credit card with your grandkids' names on it. Who wants to get drunk? He doesn't really say that. but it is kind of how it turns out. Interesting side note. The day that Reagan is inaugurated, Iran releases the hostages.
Why?
That is a great question, Aaron. We don't know. I mean, on the one hand, Iran could have been like, we need to get rid of these guys, but you know what? To hell with Jimmy Carter. We don't like that guy. That's the guy who took in the Shah of Iran and was hanging out with him, right? Like, maybe we just don't want to give him back to him because obviously, I mean, this was huge. This hurt Carter's election chances. So there's that possible reason. Some people have, and this is not documented, so don't go running with it, right? I mean, things come out. Remember, we didn't know about things Nixon did and Eisenhower till these other reports come out. It takes time for things to come out. But some people have proposed the idea that some of Reagan's campaign people worked out a deal with the Iranians that if they would hold the hostages until Reagan had until the election was over, then they would have more favorable relations towards Iran and have a better relationship. That essentially they offered them something to hold on to that. That certainly wouldn't be unprecedented, that type of involvement. Remember in 1968, Richard Nixon dispatched one of his people to stop peace talks between the North and South Vietnamese because he figured that if the war was over before the election was over, he would lose his biggest chip. So we don't know why. Maybe it was just that time of day. They were like, I'm tired of these guys. They talk English too much. And then they booted him out. I don't know. There's something going on there, though. By 1980, when he leaves office, Jimmy Carter's approval rating is 21%. 21%. America could mostly agree on something at that time. And that's that they were through with Jimmy Carter. I still remind people, he only served one term. He's eligible for another one. Everybody loves Jimmy Carter when he's not the president, but maybe give him another chance. It's been a long time. Anyway, just kidding. Let's see, America, how you feel about this election? Uh-oh. Check this map out. I don't think America feels very good about Jimmy Carter. Reagan destroys him. Carter wins his home state of Georgia. He wins West Virginia, right? You've got Maryland there, D.C., and Minnesota. Even Delaware went for Reagan. Even Delaware went for Reagan. Dang, Delaware. You just kind of being part of everybody else. Hawaii. Carter got Hawaii. That's a cool state, I guess. You add them up. Now, Reagan brings in a new theory called trickle-down economics. And we're going to talk about that more in the next lecture. Because he brings in this idea. And the idea is that if you cut taxes on the richest people, that the money will flow down and that it will then increase workers' wages. So you see a massive tax cut. And again, remember, Reagan is the president. Congress is controlled by Democrats. Stop thinking in just in political terms. A lot of the Democrats who were elected after Watergate are far more conservative Democrats even than the ones who have been elected before. So you see the tax rate drop. Reagan's going to have a couple of early losses here, though. A lot of people look back on Ronald Reagan and they're like, well, he must have been popular the whole time because he kills it in 84. He does. He's going to kill it again in 84. But you go back and you look. 1981 and 82, when he enters office, the U.S. goes into a severe recession. He doesn't get the tax reforms he wants cut in that first term. And inflation, you can see here, by the way, this is the 30-year mortgage rates that I was talking about before. You can see they go up. They're still in those first couple of years going down, but they're not under control yet. They're going to. But on the international stage, let me leave you with this. On the international stage, Reagan's commitment to fighting communism and to fighting the Iranians, or maybe not, we'll get to that, makes some interesting friends for us. Here's two wonderful pictures that I think that anybody in here can probably look at it and go, uh-oh. On the left, you have the U.S. Special Envoy appointed by Reagan, Donald Rumsfeld. Donald Rumsfeld, you may know, as George W. Bush's Secretary of Defense. He'd also been in the Nixon administration. Here's Donald Rumsfeld shaking hands with Saddam Hussein in 1983. Why? Well, it turns out Iran was getting a little too powerful. And so we funneled money and supplies to Iraq to keep Iran in check. I'll tell you about this next time, but it turns out then Iraq gets too powerful, so we're going to funnel some secret weapons to the Iranians. Anyway, long story short, that guy shaking hands with Saddam Hussein is going to be the Secretary of Defense during the war in Iraq. So, interesting outcome there, empowering Saddam Hussein. On the right, Ronald Reagan meeting with leaders from Afghanistan, freedom fighters, he calls them, a.k.a. the Mujahideen, a.k.a. the forebears, the Taliban, a.k.a. the groups that are going to be shooting at us with the weapons that we give them when we show up in Afghanistan. More on that next time. Have a good day.